This is the story of Ethan Collins, a 27-year-old man who saw his entire life wash away in a matter of minutes. Or almost. What seemed like the end became the beginning of a new life, one marked by a miracle in the form of a simple piece of rope. Before we dive into this incredible account, if you enjoy real emotional survival stories like this, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new video. And tell me in the comments, have you ever heard a story about someone surviving the impossible? I read them all. Now take a deep breath, because what you're about to hear is not just any story. Ethan grew up in Springdale, a small American town surrounded by hills and cut through by a river that all year round seemed harmless, until the unthinkable happened. That fateful week, the rains wouldn't stop. The sky poured down as if the world itself was falling apart, and the quiet little stream turned into a raging monster ready to swallow everything in its path. Ethan was a simple guy, a hard worker. He had the smile of someone who dreamed big, but his eyes showed the weariness of a tough life. He lived in a modest house with his parents and younger brother, and he never imagined the place where he grew up would become the stage of the worst nightmare of his life. That morning, the weather forecast warned of strong storms, but no one really believed the worst would come. After all, how many times had the radio mentioned torrential rain that ended up being nothing but a stubborn drizzle? But this time was different. The sky turned dark in a way that made even the most skeptical feel a chill down their spine. Thick black clouds covered the city, and within hours the water started to rise, fast, furious, sweeping away cars, toppling trees, and pouring into homes like a thief in the night. Ethan was out in the street when it all began. He'd left home early to help an elderly neighbor reinforce sandbag barriers around his house. He had no idea that by doing that, he was putting himself right in the path of destruction. The sound of water slamming against buildings, the smell of wet earth, the icy rain soaking every layer of clothing. It all felt like something out of a disaster movie, but it was real. The ground was vanishing beneath his feet, and every step became a battle against the relentless force of the current. In the blink of an eye, what was just a flood turned into a hopeless nightmare. Ethan was swept away like a rag doll, swallowed by the freezing, muddy water. The last thing he saw before disappearing was the look of panic in his younger brother's eyes, screaming his name from a distance, and the certainty that this would be his last day alive. In that moment, no one believed he'd survive. The town was in shock. His family, desperate, was already bracing for the worst. In everyone's mind, Ethan was gone. Just another name on the growing list of those missing in the tragedy. But fate had other plans. Ethan's world flipped upside down in seconds. When the current hit him, there wasn't time to think, let alone run. He felt his body ripped from the ground like it weighed nothing, like he was completely powerless against the overwhelming force of the flood. The sound was deafening. A constant roar of crashing water and debris mixed with the distant screams of terrified people. The water dragged him mercilessly, slamming him into everything in its path. Each blow knocked the air out of his lungs, like death itself was trying to drag him under. He flailed, desperately trying to grab onto something, a tree, a fence post, anything. But everything slipped through his frozen, trembling fingers. The river, once just a peaceful backdrop of Springdale, had turned into a ravenous beast. The muddy, swirling water hid deadly dangers. Branches, debris, pieces of rooftops, all spinning in a violent whirlpool. Ethan felt every crash against his body like it might be his last. He tried to scream for help, but the roar of the flood swallowed his voice. For a moment, all he could do was think of his family. His mother's worried face flashed in his mind. Then his dad, always trying to stay calm. And finally, his younger brother. Those terrified eyes burned into his memory. It can't end like this. It just can't, he thought. But hope was fading with every foot the current dragged him. That's when Ethan slammed into a tree trunk wedged between two rocks. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a second, his consciousness. When he came to, he realized that log might be his only shot at survival. He clung to it with everything he had left. The cold was brutal. Every gust of wind cut through him like a blade. His fingers began to go numb, his nails purple, his breathing shallow and ragged. He knew that if he let go, he would die, but if he stayed there too long, he'd die anyway. Time no longer existed. All Ethan could feel was the water trying to rip him away from that log. He looked around, and all he saw was destruction. Submerged homes, flipped-over cars, distant screams, and himself, trapped between life and death. In that moment, it hit him. No one knew where he was. The city was too overwhelmed trying to save those who could still cry out for help. He was just another soul swept away by the flood, invisible to everyone. And then, the despair hit, hard. He tried to scream again, but his voice barely came out. His throat burned, his chest ached. The tears mixed with the torrential rain, and for the first time, Ethan truly felt he might not make it. That's when he remembered his brother, that last look before he was taken. And that memory sparked something inside him. "I have to get out of here. I have to fight," he whispered, barely audible. But how? The log was all he had. Let go? Never. Swim? Impossible. And fear. Oh, fear had already taken over completely. Time dragged on, and the current only seemed to grow stronger. With every passing minute, the idea that there might not be a tomorrow became more and more real. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, his family was beginning to lose hope, and Ethan, there clinging to what life he had left, had no idea that fate was about to shift and that help would come from where he least expected it. At the Collins household, time had stopped. The silence, broken only by the sound of the relentless rain and the distant wails of emergency sirens, weighed heavy like a death sentence. Ethan's mother, Margaret, paced back and forth, eyes swollen from crying, hands trembling as she clutched a rosary so tightly it left marks on her skin, as if her grip alone could bring her son back. His father, Richard, tried to stay strong, but with every unanswered call, with every new name added to the list of the missing, the ground beneath him seemed to crumble. The youngest, Ryan, only 16, sat pale and silent on the couch, eyes blank, whispering over and over, "He's coming back. He's coming back." But no one really knew. The last time they'd seen Ethan was when he ran off to help old Mr. Parker, their neighbor down the street. The man was bedridden and couldn't evacuate. Ethan, always the first to help, didn't hesitate. He simply said, "I'll be right back," and vanished into the storm. Margaret clung to those words like a lifeline. But as the hours passed, fear closed in like a tightening vice. When neighbors started showing up talking about how powerful the flood had gotten and how many people were missing, panic fully took over. One of them said they saw someone who looked like Ethan being swept away near the old bridge. That was all it took. The entire family rushed out into the chaos. The town was unrecognizable. Streets submerged, cars piled like toys, homes reduced to rubble. The stench of mud and destruction hung in the air. The sounds of helicopters overhead mixed with cries for help and the wails of people who had already lost everything, or were about to. Richard was doing everything he could to find a lead. He contacted the police, the fire department, anyone who might know something. But no one had seen Ethan. His name was now being circulated among the missing, and that news hit the family like a punch to the gut. Ryan couldn't take it. He ran out into the street, screaming his brother's name, ignoring his mother's desperate cries to come back. He made his way to the point near the bridge where someone had claimed to see Ethan vanish, and when he got there, the sight was devastating. What remained of the old bridge floated in the churning water. The current was still strong, dragging everything in its path. Ryan fell to his knees, his face soaked, not just from the rain, but from the tears pouring freely. "It can't be." "He said he'd be right back," he whispered. Margaret, seeing her youngest like that, broke. She wrapped him in a desperate hug and for the first time let the fear take over. "Dear God, don't take my son. Please." Richard stood there, watching the two people he loved most collapse under the weight of hopelessness. And in that moment, he realized he wasn't just losing his son to the flood. He was losing his whole family to despair. But what could he do? The helplessness tore him apart inside. He was the father, the man of the house, and he couldn't even save his own child. The hours passed, and little by little, hope started to drain from their hearts. They knew no one survives that kind of current for this long. Neighbors gathered. Some hugged Margaret. Others tried to console Ryan. Quiet murmurs passed from one person to another. Some were already preparing the family for the worst. Some even whispered about starting arrangements for what no one wanted to say out loud: the funeral. But in Margaret's heart, a tiny flame still burned. As small as it was, she refused to believe Ethan was gone. Not like this. And it was that stubborn faith, that irrational, unwavering hope, that kept her standing. Because what none of them knew was that Ethan's story was far from over. As night fell, so did Ethan's hope. Still clinging to the log jammed between the rocks, he felt every second drag across his soaked, freezing body. The rain wouldn't let up, and the biting wind felt like it was mocking his weakness. His once strong hands now shook uncontrollably. The skin on his fingertips had begun to split open, letting his blood mix with the muddy river water. The cold was an invisible enemy. It didn't hurt. It was worse. It numbed him, stole his senses, made his body forget what it felt like to be alive. Ethan tried to focus on any thought that would keep him awake, but the exhaustion was merciless. Hunger soon joined the torment. His stomach growled, a cruel reminder that his body needed fuel to keep going. But there was nothing around but mud and despair. His mouth was dry and bitter, begging for clean water, but all he could taste was the awful flavor of the flood: dirt, filth, and death. "I'm going to die here, alone," he thought, staring up at the heavy, dark sky. The clouds hung low, like they were ready to crush him. But deep inside, a voice kept whispering, "You can't give up now. Think of them. Think of your mom. Think of Ryan." That thought made him cry. Ethan didn't know how much time had passed. Minutes, hours, everything blurred together. His hands were starting to fail him, and more than once he nearly slipped off the log. Each time his body gave out, panic surged through him like fire. He screamed, not for help, but as a primal reflex of someone fighting death with everything they had left. The roar of the current seemed to grow louder, and Ethan began to see shapes. Or maybe his mind was playing tricks. He saw his mother's face, his father's, even old Mr. Parker. They all seemed to be telling him to hold on just a little longer. But for how long? The night was even crueler. The pitch black made his imagination spiral. Every sound became a threat. The fear of being struck by invisible debris kept him on edge, but the truth was, his body didn't respond the same anymore. His strength was fading, and he knew it. He thought about letting go. Just for a second, the idea of giving in to the current felt tempting. It would be quick, painless, and the suffering would finally stop. But then, once again, his brother's face came to mind. That terrified expression right before Ethan was swept away. "I promised. I said I'd come back." And that was enough to make him hold on tighter, even if he didn't know where the strength was coming from anymore. Time crawled. The world seemed to have forgotten about him. No voices, no cries, just water and cold. Ethan didn't know if it was day or night anymore. His body shook uncontrollably, his teeth chattered, and his mind drifted in and out. Sometimes he'd fall asleep for a few seconds and jolt awake, feeling himself slipping. All he wanted was to see the sun again, to feel warmth on his skin, to hug his mother, to tell his brother that he made it. But in that endless night, all he could feel was the emptiness, and death hovering just a breath away. Morning began to break slowly. But to Ethan, it barely mattered anymore. His eyes were heavy, his body numb, and his mind floated between consciousness and oblivion. He couldn't feel his hands anymore, and he didn't even know if he was still holding on to the log by will or by some final reflex of a body clinging to survival. The water still raged, but now it felt like it was mocking him, as if it whispered, "You've already lost. I'm just waiting for you to let go." And that's when, just as everything seemed lost, when even hope had vanished, Ethan heard a different sound. A shout, distant, muffled, but real. He tried to open his eyes, saw shadows, wasn't sure if it was another hallucination. Then came another shout, louder this time. "Hey, is someone there?" Ethan's heart pounded hard, as if reigniting from nowhere. He tried to call back, but only a raspy, broken moan came out. Still, he tried again, and again. Up above, on the embankment, a man emerged from between the trees and the debris. He wore simple, soaked clothes, his face smeared with mud. But in his eyes was something Ethan hadn't seen in a long time. Determination. The stranger quickly assessed the situation. He saw Ethan clinging to the log, barely alive. Without a second thought, the man, who Ethan would later learn was named Tom, tied a makeshift rope around a tree. It was an old, worn rope, probably salvaged from some ruined garage. But in that moment, it was the thin line between life and death. Tom took a deep breath and shouted, "Grab the rope! Can you do it?" Ethan could barely lift his head. Tears streamed down his filthy face. He tried to move his hands, but they wouldn't obey. Tom quickly realized the boy wouldn't be able to grab the rope on his own. So without hesitating, Tom tied the rope around his own waist and started descending the muddy slope, carefully navigating the branches and loose rocks, fighting against the slick earth. Every step was a risk, but Tom knew. There was no turning back now. When Tom got close enough, he shouted again, "I'm gonna get you. Just hold on a little longer." Ethan felt the world spin. That last spark of life inside him clung to that voice. Someone had come. Someone cared. He wasn't alone anymore. Tom managed to get close enough, threw the rope with all his strength, and with some effort, tied it around the log where Ethan was trapped. Then, bracing one leg and holding onto the other end of the rope, he stretched out his arm. "Give me your hand!" And in that instant, everything changed. Ethan summoned what little strength he had left, and in one last desperate push, reached out. Their fingers touched, cold, trembling, barely alive. But it was enough. Tom pulled with everything he had, grunting in pain and effort. The current tried to take them both, but the rope held. Inch by inch, Tom dragged Ethan upward, feeling the weight, not just of his body, but of a soul that had lost everything, except the will to live. And when he finally got Ethan to the riverbank, they both collapsed. Tom held him tightly, like someone clinging to life itself. Ethan sobbed, uncontrollably, like a child, unable to believe he was still there, alive. That old frayed rope, in the hands of a total stranger, had changed everything. And then, the sun finally broke through, as if the sky itself was celebrating. The relief of having Ethan there, breathing, was so overwhelming that Tom needed a few seconds to realize the next challenge: how to get him out of there. Ethan's body barely responded. Uncontrollable tremors ran through every muscle, and his blue lips left no doubt. He was at his limit. Time was against them. If they stayed there a few minutes longer, the boy wouldn't make it. Tom looked around for anything that could help. The rope was still secure, but the distance to a safe spot was long. Still, he didn't hesitate. "We're getting out of here, man. You're going home. You hear me?" he said, more to himself than to the barely conscious boy in his arms. With great effort, Tom hoisted Ethan onto his back and tied them together with the rope. Every step was a battle. The muddy ground gave way, branches cut into their skin, and the current still threatened to pull them back in. But Tom pressed on, a man driven by something he couldn't even explain. Up above, the sky finally began to ease. The rain started to fade, and small rays of light pierced the heavy clouds, as if lighting the way home. Meanwhile, Ethan's family didn't know what to feel anymore. Margaret sat on the porch of the church that had been turned into a shelter, eyes fixed on the road, whispering prayers with barely a voice left. Richard and Ryan were still searching for updates, but all they got were lists, names of the missing, names of the dead. That's when a firefighter approached. "We found a young man near the old warehouse. They're bringing him in now." Margaret didn't think. She ran, stumbling through the mud, her heart racing. "God, please, let it be my boy." The dirt road felt endless until in the distance she saw two figures approaching. A man carrying another on his back, both covered in mud, exhausted, but alive. When Tom reached them, he could barely speak. but his eyes said it all. Is it Ethan?" Margaret asked, unable to hold back the tears. Tom nodded, and with the last of his strength, gently laid Ethan down. "He's alive. He fought like hell." Margaret fell to her knees, wrapping her son in her arms. Ethan opened his eyes slowly, and when he saw her, a faint smile formed on his cracked lips. "Mom, I made it back." A wave of relief washed over the place. Richard and Ryan arrived moments later, and the scene was heart-wrenching. Ryan dropped to his knees beside his brother, sobbing. "I thought I lost you. I saw you disappear." Ethan, struggling, reached out and touched his brother's face. "I promised I'd come back. And here I am." Neighbors standing nearby were in tears. Even the firefighters turned away, wiping their eyes. Tom stood back, watching that family come back together, feeling a lump in his throat. He didn't know who Ethan was, or why, out of everyone, he had risked his life to save this stranger. But something deep inside told him it was meant to be. Margaret turned to Tom, her hands still shaking. "I don't even know how to thank you. You saved my son. You saved our family." Tom gave a quiet smile and said, "He saved himself. I was just in the right place at the right time." In that moment, no one cared about what they had lost in the flood. Ethan was there, alive, and that was all that mattered. But what they didn't know was that this story was far from over. The reunion had been emotional, but Ethan's true nightmare was only beginning. After the tight embrace from his mother and the desperate sobs of his younger brother, the firefighters quickly realized Ethan's condition was critical. His skin was ice cold, almost bluish, and his vital signs were dangerously weak. Without wasting a second, they loaded him into the ambulance and headed straight for the hospital in the neighboring town. Springdale's own had been overwhelmed by evacuees. Margaret rode with him, gripping his hand the entire way like she was afraid he'd disappear again. "Stay with me, Ethan. Just a little longer," she whispered, tears pouring uncontrollably down her face. At the hospital, the medical team worked against the clock. Ethan was in a state of severe hypothermia, his heart barely beating and his lungs burdened with all the water he had swallowed. He was rushed straight to the ICU, intubated, with no guarantee he would survive the night. Outside, the family endured the worst weight of their lives. Richard tried to keep it together, but each hour without news only deepened the weight of guilt. "I should have gone after him. I should have done something," he repeated over and over, as if it could somehow rewrite the past. Ryan never left his mother's side, his gaze empty, mind stuck in the loop of what he'd witnessed. Watching his brother get swept away, that image would haunt him forever. Hours later, a doctor finally stepped out, his face somber. "He's strong. He's fighting. But it's going to take time. His body's been through enormous trauma, and so has his mind." And so began the longest days of the Collins' lives. Ethan had survived, but the scars remained. When he woke up 2 days later, he was unrecognizable. Pale face, sunken eyes, voice barely a whisper. It took time for him to understand where he was. And when he did, panic took hold. He started screaming, thrashing in the bed, as if he were still trapped on that log. Nurses rushed to calm him, but that was just the beginning. The trauma of the flood haunted even his dreams. Ethan would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced the water was dragging him away again. Margaret, always beside his bed, would hold her son tight and cry silently. The doctors explained it was expected. The body would heal, but the mind would take much longer. Ethan lost weight, went weeks unable to eat properly. Even the sound of running water from a faucet made him freeze. The spark once bright in his eyes had dimmed, now shadowed by fear. A fear that everything could end at any moment. Neighbors came by to visit, always bringing something: food, flowers, kind words. But no one really knew what to say, because the truth was, everyone there knew Ethan had come back. But a part of him had stayed behind in that flood. Margaret never left his side. Ryan had changed too. The once talkative, playful teen was now quiet, always watching his brother, as if afraid he might vanish again at any moment. And the worst part was the fear. Fear of the next storm, the next downpour, the next flood. Ethan knew that from now on, he would never hear the sound of rain the same way again. Every clap of thunder would be a trigger, every heavy cloud a warning that it could all happen again. But deep down, even with all the fear and scars, Ethan was still here, breathing, surviving. Weeks passed in the hospital until the doctor finally cleared him to go home. But the boy who walked out of that hospital ward was not the same one everyone remembered. He was thinner, his gaze distant, his body fragile in ways he'd never known. And still, he was here, and that alone was a miracle. The drive back to Springdale was silent. Ethan looked out the ambulance window like he was seeing the world for the first time. A world that had nearly swallowed him whole and now welcomed him back. The streets were unrecognizable. Homes destroyed, trees uprooted, cars stacked like toys. The flood had left deep scars everywhere. When they reached home, Ethan hesitated. He stood at the front door, taking a deep breath, unsure if he could take that step. But his mother's hand, gripping his, brought him back to the present. "Come on, son. You're home now." That embrace in the living room was the first sign that, despite everything, life had to move forward. Ryan wouldn't leave his brother's side. He slept in the room next door, ready to run at the first sound. Richard stayed quiet, always watching, pride and unspoken fear written across his face. But what no one expected was what came next. Word of Ethan's rescue began to spread through town. It didn't take long before neighbors, friends, even strangers started showing up. Some brought food, others clothes, others simply words of comfort. But what moved Ethan the most was the light in their eyes when they saw him standing. "You're a miracle, son," they'd say. "God gave you a second chance." And in a way, that's exactly how Ethan felt. Even if he still didn't know what he was supposed to do with that second chance, the community came together like never before. They launched a fundraiser to help the Collins family start over. Ordinary people who had also lost everything shared what little they had just to make sure Ethan and his family had the basics to move forward. Little by little, Ethan began to take his first steps outside. Every trip to the gate felt like a challenge. The sound of water, even if it was just from a neighbor's faucet, still made his skin crawl. But he went, a little at a time. Ryan was his biggest companion on that journey. Always there, cracking silly jokes, dragging his brother outside to watch the sunset, or just sit on the porch and listen to the crickets. Small things, but to Ethan, they meant everything. Margaret, between one act of care and another, gently encouraged her son to talk about what he was feeling. And even through tears and long silences, Ethan began to let go of the weight he'd been carrying in his chest. Slowly, the Ethan from before started to return. One day, old Mr. Parker, the man Ethan had gone to help at the start of the flood, showed up at the house. He hugged the boy tightly and said, his voice thick with emotion, "You saved my life, Ethan, and now it's my turn to help you find yours again." And those words stuck with Ethan. Maybe he had survived for a reason. Maybe that rope thrown by a stranger wasn't just chance, but a sign that life still had something left to offer. And for the first time since everything happened, Ethan believed that starting over was possible. Time went on, and even with the scars still visible, something inside Ethan began to change. It wasn't easy. Every day, he still battled the fear, the flashbacks of icy water trying to drag him under, the recurring nightmares of feeling his body submerge. But there was a new spark, a will he didn't quite understand yet. He realized it one random morning when Ryan came running into the house, excited, saying the town was organizing a survivors' meeting, a gathering to give voice to those who had lived through the worst and were still here. "You have to go, Ethan. They need to hear your story." "I need to hear it again," his brother insisted, smiling with hope. Ethan hesitated, like always. Talking about that day still hurt, but deep down, something inside him wanted to go. When he arrived, at a school now being used as a community center, the weight of what he'd lived through hit him all over again. Familiar faces, some he barely knew, all marked by pain, by loss, but also by a desire to move on. And there, in that circle of everyday people, he realized he wasn't alone. When it was his turn to speak, Ethan took a deep breath. The words came out slowly, tearing at his throat. But he told his story about being swept away, about how close death had come, and how a rope thrown by a stranger changed everything. When he finished, the room fell into heavy silence, followed by applause, not of celebration, but of deep respect. And in that moment, he felt it. Maybe I survived for something bigger. After that meeting, something ignited in Ethan. He began to wonder how many people had similar stories, and how many didn't have a Tom in the right place at the right time. The town was full of people who were hurting, not just in body, but in spirit. People who had lost everything, people who didn't know where to start again. That's when, for the first time since the tragedy, Ethan had a dream. And it wasn't a nightmare. He wanted to create something, a group, a support network, anything to make those people feel seen, heard, valued. With the help of Ryan, Margaret, old Mr. Parker, and even Tom, who was now part of the family, he started sketching out the project. That's how Lifelines of Hope was born, a group of survivors who gathered every week, not to talk about what they had lost, but to talk about life, about how every person there, despite everything, was still standing. Ethan led the meetings, sometimes with a trembling voice, but always with steady eyes. Every story he heard only strengthened what he already knew. That rope, that moment, hadn't just changed his destiny. It had changed the lives of everyone who now felt part of something bigger. Slowly, the town began to rebuild. Houses were being repaired, streets cleared. But the most important rebuilding was happening in people's hearts. Ethan discovered that the tragedy didn't define him. What defined who he was what he chose to do after. Now, he no longer carried the weight of guilt or the fear of what he had endured. He carried the certainty that no matter how strong the currents of life may come, there would always be a rope, and someone willing to throw it. Time passed. The town rebuilt. And so did Ethan. From the boy who almost didn't make it out of the flood, the scars remained. Some visible, others hidden deep within. But now all of them told a different story. A story of resilience, of rebirth, and above all, of gratitude. Lifelines of Hope grew. What started as a neighborly conversation circle became a real movement in the community. People from nearby towns came to listen and share their stories. Men, women, young people, all with one thing in common. They had survived. And Ethan was the thread that tied them all together. He became a symbol. Not because he wanted to, but because he represented what everyone there felt, that no one, absolutely no one, comes out of a tragedy unscathed. But everyone can find new meaning after it. One day, while organizing another meeting of the group, Ethan received an unexpected visitor. Tom showed up, this time cleaned up, smiling, his eyes full of emotion. "I never thought that old rope would do so much," he joked, drawing laughter from the entire room. But deep down, everyone knew. That rope was more than a rescue tool. It was the thread that tied two lives together and gave birth to something much greater. And it was at that meeting that Ethan, for the first time, managed to speak without crying. He told his entire story, every detail, every fear, and when he finished, he looked around and saw something he would never forget. Everyone was there, alive, strong, and for a moment he felt like it had all been worth it. "You know," he began, "life really is unpredictable. One day you're here, making plans for tomorrow, and the next, all that's left is the fight to survive. I was there, at the bottom, and honestly, I didn't think I'd make it out alive, but I did. And what I've learned is that we don't always get to control what happens to us, but we can always choose what to do with what's left." The room fell silent. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice steady, eyes shining. "Today, I choose to live. I choose to honor every second I've been given. And more than that, I choose to be someone's rope if they ever need one." That day, even the sky seemed clearer. Margaret, eyes filled with tears, hugged her son like it was the first time. Richard, quiet as always, simply nodded, the kind of nod that carried more pride than words ever could. And Ryan, Ryan was smiling in a way he hadn't in a long time, because he knew his brother was back. Not the same, but maybe even better. Old Mr. Parker stepped forward too and said something Ethan would never forget. You survived, son, but more than that, you were reborn. And you know, there are people who live their whole lives without ever getting the chance to understand the true value of life. But you did. Ethan smiled. The past was still there. The memories, the nightmares, all of it still existed. But now they were part of who he was. And instead of chains, they had become wings. In the end, it wasn't Ethan's strength that saved him. It wasn't the rope or luck. It was the sum of everything, and the unshakable truth that even when we think there's no way out, there is always, always a spark of hope. And that day, looking up at the clear sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin, Ethan knew one thing for sure. He hadn't been saved just to survive. His life had purpose.